Welcome to Restory Nights, where history helps you fall asleep.
In an age before furnaces and thermostats, survival was a craft learned from birth. For a medieval peasant family, the enemy was not just the cold that clawed at the walls, but the gnawing hunger within and the ancient darkness without. This is the story of one family's battle against the longest night. The sun, for weeks, had been a reluctant visitor. It rose late, a pale, watery disk that skimmed the southern horizon, and fell early, bleeding a weak, rust-colored light across the stubble of the harvested fields. But this day was different. This day, the sun did not bleed out, it was executed. A hard final line was drawn between the gray sky and the black earth, and with its passing, a new kind of cold arrived. It was not the crisp, bracing chill of autumn, but a deep, predatory cold that had the weight of iron and the stillness of the grave. From the doorway of his low-slung hut, Adric watched the last of the light being consumed by the forest that bordered their village. He was a man shaped by the seasons, his face a road map of sun squints and wind burns, his hands thick and calloused from a lifetime of wrestling a living from the heavy soil. He tasted the air, a familiar, grim ritual. The wind had shifted. It no longer carried the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It now smelled of stone and ice, a clean, sterile scent that promised nothing but hardship. "Bar the door, Finn," he said, his voice a low rumble that was not unkind. "And pack the gaps with fresh straw. The old wolf is sniffing at the threshold." His son, a boy of 10 winters who was fast losing the softness of childhood, moved with a practiced economy, his small frame already mimicking his father's stoop-shouldered pragmatism. He heaved the heavy oak bar into its iron brackets, the sound a definitive thump that sealed them inside their world. That world was a single, long room, hazy with the smoke from the central fire pit that was its heart. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, of unwashed wool, of the nearby animals, and of the simmering pottage that was their evening meal. To an outsider, it would have been stifling, but to the family, it was the smell of life itself. Ilara, Adric's wife, knelt by the fire, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon. Her face, illuminated by the fire's glow, was weary but resolute. Her eyes, in a constant sweeping inventory, took stock of their domain. This room was her ledger, and she knew every entry by heart. Their wealth was not in coin, but in calories, measured in the careful geometry of their stores. Hanging from the low, smoke-blackened rafters were strings of hard yellow onions and shriveled apples, their skins wrinkled like an old woman's knuckles. In one corner, covered by a dry animal hide, was the precious mound of grain, wheat and barley, ground by hand each day to make their dense, dark bread. Beside it were sacks of dried peas and beans, hard as pebbles, that would swell into tasteless but life-giving mush in the months to come. A single wheel of hard cheese, a product of their cow's summer milk, was wrapped in cloth, to be shaved from sparingly. In a barrel of brine floated the salted flanks of the pig they had slaughtered at Michaelmas. This was it, the sum of a year's sweat and prayer. It was not enough, and they both knew it. "The frost will be deep tonight," Ilara said, not looking up from the fire. It wasn't a prediction. It was a statement of fact. "The cow is restless," Adric replied, moving to the far end of the longhouse. There, separated from the family's living space by a low wattle partition, were their true treasures. Bess, their aging milk cow, shifted her weight, her warm grassy breath misting in the cold air. Her milk was already thinning with the poor winter fodder, but her warmth was a second hearth. A few scrawny chickens huddled together in a small coop, their clucking a nervous, muted sound. This was the brutal calculus of medieval survival. These creatures were both companions and commodities. Their body heat was a vital resource until their bodies became one. Little Agnes, barely 5 years old, toddled over to the partition and reached a small hand through the gaps to touch the cow's coarse hide. "Bess is cold, Papa." "Aye," Adric grunted, checking the mud and straw packing in the wall behind the animals. "We are all cold now, little bird." He worked methodically, finding the tiny cracks and holes where the wind, their tireless enemy, sought entry. Their hut was a fragile fortress of wattle and daub, a lattice of woven hazel branches packed with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. It was a constant battle to maintain its integrity. Every gust of wind was a scouting party, seeking a weakness. As the family gathered around the fire for their meal, the full weight of their isolation settled. Their village was a small island of a dozen such huts in a vast, darkening ocean of forest and moor. The pottage was thin, mostly root vegetables with a few precious scraps of salted pork for flavor. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scrape of spoons against wooden bowls. After the meal, the true work of the night began. The fire, which had been fed generously for cooking, was now carefully managed for longevity. Adric chose the logs with the care of a jeweler selecting gems. Greenwood to smolder slowly, a large half-burned log to form a solid base. He then banked the fire, covering the embers with a thick layer of ash. This was a skill passed down through generations, a form of peasant magic, how to keep the heart of the home beating through the long dark hours without consuming all their precious fuel in a single night. A dead fire at 3 a.m. was a death sentence. Elara prepared their bed, a single large mattress on the floor, a shallow wooden frame filled with a deep layer of straw which rustled as she spread their few woolen blankets over it. The straw served not just as a cushion, but as vital insulation against the cold that seeped up from the packed earth floor. Finn brought in the last of his day's work, a small pile of pine cones and dried moss he had gathered. "The north wind has stripped the trees bare already, Father. The woodpile is not as high as last year's woodpile." I put a hand on his son's shoulder, a rare gesture of comfort. The winter is not last year's winter. It was a truth that hung unspoken in the smoky air. The old ones in the village were whispering that this would be a hard winter, a cold that would bite deep and hold on long. They spoke of the coming wolf month. The wolf month when the world was frozen solid, the larder was bare, and the wolves, driven by hunger, grew bold enough to hunt at the edge of the village. The wolves were a real threat, but they were also a metaphor for the other things that hunted them in the deep winter, the gnawing hunger in their bellies and the fever that could steal a child in the night. As the family settled into the communal bed, burrowing under the scratchy wool for warmth, Adric took one last look around the room. He saw the meager stores, the chinks in the walls, the faces of his sleeping family, their breaths puffing like tiny clouds in the cold air. He saw all that stood between them and the vast, indifferent darkness outside. He sat on a low stool by the banked fire, a heavy blanket pulled around his shoulders, taking the first watch. Outside, the wind began to howl, a low, mournful cry that sounded like a hungry animal. The sun was gone. The world had been shut, and they were locked inside with their fears and a single dwindling pile of wood. The long siege had begun.
The night was not a time for sleep, not for Adric. It was a time for vigil. He sat on a low three-legged stool, his back to the wattle and daub wall, a coarse woolen blanket wrapped tightly around his broad shoulders. The rest of his family was a single breathing mound in the straw-stuffed bed, a tangle of limbs and quiet sighs. Beyond the thin walls, the wind, a tireless hunter, scoured the frozen landscape, its voice a low moan in the roof's thatch. But the true enemy was not the wind. It was the silence that would follow if the heart in the center of the room stopped beating. This heart was the fire. Not a roaring, cheerful blaze, but a slumbering creature, its life carefully preserved beneath a thick blanket of gray ash. A single ruby-red eye, the size of a man's fist, glowed from a crack in its ashen shell, pulsing faintly with each subtle draught. It exhaled a thin, almost invisible ribbon of smoke that rose towards the smoke hole in the roof, and a meager, precious warmth that did little more than blunt the edge of the soul-stealing cold. Adric's world, and the world of his family, was defined by the radius of this faint warmth. To be within its circle was to live. To be outside it was to slowly freeze. His duty on this watch was simple but sacred, to keep the heart beating. He did not feed it. To do so would be to waste the fuel that had been so dearly bought. Instead, he watched it, listened to it, understood its slow, rhythmic respiration. He knew by the pitch of the wind's howl when a new gust was testing the daub in the walls, and by the subtle shift in the glow if the embers needed a gentle prod to keep from suffocating. This was not just a fire. It was an extension of his own will to survive, a testament to a craft learned over 1,000 such nights, passed from father to son since time immemorial. The life of this fire was paid for in the currency of daylight and sweat. Its hunger was insatiable, and feeding it was the family's primary, relentless work. Long before this night, in the fading light of an autumn afternoon, the desperate toil had begun. Adric and his son Finn had ventured into the Lord's woods, not with the confidence of owners, but with the furtive anxiety of tenants. The great oaks and beeches were forbidden, their timber the property of the manor. To fell one was to risk a hand or worse. The peasants were allowed what the forest shed willingly, the deadfall from the previous winter's storms, and the branches harvested from the coppiced hazels and ash trees that grew in the underwood. The work was brutal. The cold was a physical weight that settled in the bones, making muscles ache and joints stiffen. Adric, with his heavy iron-headed axe, would attack a fallen log, his breath pluming in the frigid air with each percussive thwack. The wood was frozen, hard as iron, and the axe would often bounce with a jarring shock that shuttered up his arms. Thin, too small for an axe, was armed with a billhook. His task was to gather the smaller branches, his fingers raw and red, fumbling with the frozen wood. Every branch was a victory, every log a treasure. They worked until the weak sun threatened to abandon them, and then came the agonizing haul back to the village, dragging their meager bounty on a crude sledge, their bodies screaming with the effort. This raw, wet wood was not yet fuel. It was a promise. The true art lay in the seasoning. Inside the longhouse, one entire wall was given over to the woodpile, a carefully constructed altar to warmth. The driest, most seasoned logs, wood gathered in the summer, baked by the sun, its moisture long since surrendered, were at the front, within easy reach. This was the burning wood, the fuel for the immediate future. Behind it was the wood from autumn, still weeping sap, which would need weeks in the smoky, dry air of the hut to become viable. Every log was placed with intention, allowing air to circulate. To burn green wood was an act of desperation. It produced more smoke than heat, a choking, eye-watering fog that would fill the small room and steal the breath, a fool's bargain of suffocation for a flicker of warmth. Every aspect of their lives was tethered to this central, smoking heart. At dawn, Ilara would be the first to approach it. She would carefully scrape away the ash, revealing the glowing embers beneath. With dried moss and a gentle breath, she would coax the creature back to life, feeding it small twigs until it was strong enough to accept a larger log. This morning fire was the center of their universe. It heated the water for their meager ablutions. It was over its flames that the day's pottage was hung, a thick, bubbling stew of peas and root vegetables that would simmer for hours, its smell mingling with the ever-present smoke. Their world was a map of concentric circles drawn by heat. The very center, the hearth itself, was Ilara's domain for cooking. The next circle, a space of a few feet, was where the family worked when the sun failed them. Here, in the flickering, unreliable light, Ilara would spin wool into thread, her fingers moving with a tireless rhythm. Adric would repair a tool, the firelight glinting on the worn metal. Finn and Agnes would huddle close, their faces orange in the glow, listening to stories that were as old as the stones in the field. Tales of saints and dragons, of the green man in the woods and the terrible ghosts that haunted the winter roads. The final circle, where the warmth was more a memory than a sensation, was the sleeping area. Proximity to the fire at night was a matter of survival, not comfort. The children were placed on the side of the straw bed closest to the embers, their small bodies less able to fight the cold. Adric and Ilara slept on the outside, their larger forms acting as a barrier against the chill that radiated from the walls. Beyond this circle of life was the animal pen, where Bess the cow added her own considerable warmth to the fragile ecosystem of the hut. Now, in the deepest part of the night, Adric understood the fire's true nature. It was a demanding god. It required constant sacrifice of their time, their strength, their meager forests. In return, it offered not comfort, but a stay of execution. He rose from his stool and moved stiffly to the hearth. The ruby eye had shrunk, the glow dimming. It was time for the most delicate part of the ritual. He took a long, smoldering log from the edge of the fire, the banking log, chosen for its density and slow burn. He placed it carefully over the heart of the embers, then used a flat stone to scoop the insulating ash back over it, entombing its heat, ensuring its life would last until his watch was over. He finished his work and returned to his stool, pulling the blanket tighter. The wind howled, and he heard a faint scratching at the door. Likely just a branch, but in the dark it could be anything. He looked at the gentle rise and fall of his family's breathing in the straw, and then at the faint, steady pulse of red light from the hearth. The two rhythms were one and the same. The heart of his family and the heart of the longhouse, beating together in the vast, consuming darkness, holding the promise of one more dawn.
Adric's watch ended in the profound, bone-deep cold that came just before the dawn. The wind outside had fallen to a low, keening whisper, and the world was locked in a silence so complete it felt like the earth had stopped breathing. The embers of the fire, entombed in ash, offered less warmth than a fading memory. This was the hour of greatest peril, when the cold, having tested the walls all night, finally began to seep through in earnest, a relentless, invisible tide. It was time to surrender to the final and most ancient strategy of survival. He rose from his stool, his joints cracking like dry twigs. The air was frigid, each inhalation a sharp pain in his lungs. He moved not towards the fire, but towards the rustling mound in the corner, the communal bed that was less a piece of furniture and more a nest woven from desperation and straw. It was a shallow wooden frame on the packed earth floor, filled to overflowing with the year's worth of saved straw. It was their island of insulation in a sea of cold. Alara was already there, a still form on the far side. She had arranged the children with the strategic precision of a general. Agnes, the smallest and most fragile, was in the very center, a precious kernel protected on all sides. Her small, sleeping face was half buried in the scratchy wool, her breath a tiny, rhythmic puff. Finn was curled beside her, his lanky frame wrapped around his sister in an unconscious, protective embrace. They were a single organism, a breathing mound of shared warmth, their individual lives surrendered to the collective need to fend off the encroaching frost. Adric lifted the heavy blanket and slid in on the outermost edge, his body a cold shock against the relative warmth of the nest. He pulled the blanket over his shoulders, his back pressed against the freezing daub of the outer wall, making himself the final barrier. Here, in the dark, identity dissolved. He was not a father or a husband. He was a warm body, another log on the human fire. The intimacy was not one of affection, but of primal necessity. He could feel the faint tremor of Finn's shivering through the straw, smell the milky scent of Agnes's sleep, and feel the slow, steady rhythm of Alara's breathing beside him. But they were not alone. The fragile warmth they generated was not enough to defy a night such as this. The true bastion against the cold lay just a few feet away, on the other side of a flimsy wattle partition. From the darkness came a sound, a slow, wet, rhythmic grinding. It was the sound of Bess, their cow, chewing her cud. It was the deepest and most reassuring sound in Adric's world. To bring livestock into the longhouse was a practice born of brutal arithmetic. A grown cow's body was a slow-burning furnace, a massive living engine of heat that ran on nothing but hay and water. To leave her in the byre on a night like this was to risk finding a frozen statue in the morning, a catastrophic loss of milk, cheese, and the promise of a spring calf. But to bring her inside was to gain a second hearth, one that breathed and shifted and filled their small world with its overwhelming vital presence. The partition did little to separate the two halves of the hut. It was a porous border through which sound, scent, and warmth freely passed. Bess's great warm body, lying on her own bed of straw, radiated a steady animal heat that was the anchor of their survival. I could hear every nuance of her existence, the soft thud of her tail against the wall, the deep guttural sigh as she shifted her weight, the wet snuffling sound of her breath. She was not a pet, she was a partner in this nightly siege. The air in the long house was a thick, complex tapestry of smells, a perfume of life stitched together in the dark. The sharp, acrid scent of wood smoke which clung to the thatch, their clothes, and the very marrow of their bones was the top note. Beneath it was the sweet, dusty fragrance of the straw, a scent of the long-dead summer. Woven through it all was the close, earthy smell of unwashed human bodies huddled together under heavy wool. But the dominant scent, the one that saturated everything, was the rich, primal aroma of the beasts. It was the warm, grassy smell of Bess's breath, the sharp tang of ammonia from the damp patches in the straw where she and the chickens had relieved themselves, and the deep, musky odor of her hide. To a modern nose, it would have been an unbearable stench. To Adric and his family, it was the smell of wealth. It was the smell of a living cow, of eggs in the morning, of a family that would not starve or freeze before the winter was out. It was the potent, undeniable smell of survival. A small whimper broke the stillness. Agnes was stirring in her sleep, her small body trembling with a chill. Instantly, Alara's arm tightened around her, pulling the child deeper into the human cocoon. From the other side of the partition, Bess let out a low, guttural moo, a sound of mild complaint, or perhaps simple restlessness. Adric's eyes snapped open in the dark. Every sound from the cow was a piece of intelligence to be analyzed. Was that a moan of contentment or of sickness? Was her breathing shallow? Was she getting enough fodder? The cow's health was inextricably linked to their own. A fever in Bess's blood was as dangerous as a fever in his own child's. He listened intently for a long moment until he heard the familiar rhythmic grinding of her cud chewing resume. He relaxed, but only slightly. The anxiety never truly slept. He lay there, suspended between the shallow breathing of his daughter and the deep bovine sighs of his cow. These two sounds were the twin rhythms of his world, the double beat of a single struggling heart. The breath of his kin warmed his front. The breath of his beast warmed his back. Their exhalations mingled in the frigid air, rising together in a single ghostly plume towards the smoke hole in the roof, a visible offering to the cold, uncaring gods of the night. This was the raw, unwritten contract of their existence. They were a single, interdependent ecosystem under one flimsy roof of thatch. The humans provided shelter and fodder. The beasts provided milk, eggs, and their precious, life-sustaining heat. Stripped of all illusion, they were simply a collection of warm-blooded creatures huddled together, their combined breaths a fragile shield against the vast, killing cold. It was a smelly, intimate, and profoundly sacred alliance, the only thing that stood between their small, flickering lives and the long, unwaking dawn.
The day began not with the sun, but with the sound of stone grinding on stone. In the gray, pre-dawn gloom of the longhouse, while Adric and the children were still deep in the shared warmth of the straw bed, Ilara was already at work. She knelt before the quern, the two heavy circular stones that were her most vital tool. Into the top stone's small opening, she fed a carefully measured handful of grain from a small wooden bowl. It was a meager blend of wheat and barley, extended with a scattering of dried pea flour, a trick to make the precious grain last longer. As she turned the handle, the stones began their slow, laborious conversation, a gritty, rumbling sound that was the true music of their winter life. It was back-breaking work. Her shoulders ached, and a fine, gritty dust coated her hands and the front of her woolen tunic. The flour that trickled from the sides was not the fine white powder of a baker's dream. It was a coarse gray meal, flecked with bran and stone dust. This was their daily bread, the very foundation of their existence. An hour later, the bread was baking on a hot, flat stone set at the edge of the fire pit. It did not rise into a proud loaf, but cooked into a dense, dark disk, its crust hard enough to break a tooth. The smell was not the comforting aroma of a kitchen, but the raw, earthy scent of toasted grain and hardship. This bread was not meant for pleasure. It was fuel, a heavy, chewy ballast against the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. This was the rhythm of their lives, a liturgy of scarcity dictated by the contents of their winter larder. Ilara was the high priestess of this faith, and her sacred duty was one of constant, agonizing calculation. Every meal was a battle fought in her mind before it was ever served. After the morning bread was eaten, each family member receiving a single, thick slice, chewed slowly and deliberately, Ilara would perform the ritual that was the source of her deepest anxiety. She would go to the corner of the hut where their wealth was stored, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not see sacks and barrels. She saw a dwindling hourglass, each grain of wheat a falling second, measuring the time they had left. She would run her hand down the side of the main grain sack, feeling for its level, her touch as sensitive as a physician's. The sack, once plump and firm at the end of the harvest, was now growing soft and slack. It sagged in the middle, a visible sign of their declining fortunes. She would count the remaining onions hanging from the rafters, her lips moving silently, subtracting the ones she would use for the day's pottage. She would lift the cloth on the cheese wheel, noting with a cold pang how its circumference had shrunk, how the marks from her knife were marching steadily towards its center. Their diet was a monotonous cycle of textures and faint tastes, a study in the art of subsistence. The centerpiece of every day was the pottage, a thick, bubbling stew that simmered perpetually in the iron pot over the fire. It was the color of mud, a thick slurry of dried peas and whatever root vegetables they had managed to store. Its flavor was the faint sweetness of a single chopped onion and the smoky taste of the fire itself. The greatest luxury was a sliver of fat, carved from the great stiff flanks of salted pork that hung from the rafters. This pork was their treasure, the ghost of a summer feast. Preserved in a mountain of salt, it was now hard as wood, its surface crystalline with salt crystals. When Adric carved from it, he did so with the precision of a surgeon, slicing off a piece no thicker than a leaf. The meat was not for eating in its own right, it was a seasoning. A single tiny piece dropped into the pottage would dissolve, its intense saltiness and faint smoky flavor infusing the entire pot. To chew on a piece directly was an agony of salt that left one desperately thirsty, but it was a reminder of richness, a memory of a time of plenty. The children born into this world knew its rules instinctively, but their bodies still cried out with a child's simple hunger. One evening, as Alara ladled the pottage into their bowls, little Agnes looked up, her eyes wide and hopeful. "Any more pork today, Mama?" she asked, her voice small. Ilara's heart clenched. It was a physical pain, sharp and swift. She looked at the thin, watery stew in the pot and then at her daughter's trusting face. To give her more today meant less for all of them tomorrow. "The pork has to last until the sun comes back, little bird," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Eat your pottage. It will make you strong." Agnes did as she was told, but Ilara did not miss the slight quiver of her lip. She saw Adric watching them from across the fire, his face grim. He was the provider, the man who had tilled the soil and swung the scythe, but in here, against the slow, creeping enemy of starvation, he was powerless. His strength could not fill an empty sack. He could only trust in her discipline, in her cruel, necessary arithmetic. Later that night, long after the others were asleep, Ilara lay awake. The cold was a constant presence, but it was the gnawing fear in her gut that kept her from rest. She could not see the larder in the dark, but she saw it perfectly in her mind. She visualized the cheese wheel, shaving off another day's portion in her thoughts. She saw the bottom of the salt pork barrel. She felt the weight of the remaining beans in their sack. She found herself praying not to God for a miracle, but to the mice not to find the grain, to the damp not to spoil the apples, to the winter not to linger a week longer than her calculations allowed. Her burden was silent and absolute. Adric fought the cold with his axe, but she fought the emptiness with her will, a constant, draining battle against the simple, brutal fact of their dwindling resources. One week, a small disaster struck. A patch of mold, green and fuzzy, was discovered on the precious cheese wheel. Her breath caught in her throat. She took her knife and with a shaking hand cut away the offending section, her cut going deep into the healthy cheese to ensure the rot was gone. The piece she cut away was the size of her fist, a week's worth of cheese gone. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury she could not afford. She simply wrapped the cheese in a new clean cloth and adjusted the numbers in her head. They would eat less cheese. The pottage would be thinner. Their family would be hungrier. As she lay in the straw bed that night, the wind howling its hungry song, she felt the emptiness in her own stomach as a familiar dull ache. It was her constant companion. She thought of the coming months, the deep, endless landscape of winter that still stretched before them. The larder was lean now, but soon it would be gaunt. Soon they would be counting not sacks, but handfuls. And the fear, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, was that one day she would go to the corner of their hut, and there would be nothing left to count at all.
The wind was a living thing.
It had a voice, a low, relentless moan that frayed the nerves, but it also had hands, countless, invisible, and cruel. These hands were never still. They clawed at the thatch of the roof, seeking to peel it back. They pressed against the thin daub of the walls, testing for weakness. And most persistently, they searched for the cracks, the tiny, insignificant gaps around the doorframe and the single wooden shutter, through which they could inject needle-sharp daggers of cold into the heart of the longhouse. The family's war against winter was not fought on an open field, but here, in a desperate, unending defense of these fragile borders. This war had two fronts. Adric and Finn fought it with mud and straw. Ilara fought it with the needle and the spindle. Her battle was a constant, patient one, waged in the flickering, unreliable light of the fire. On her lap lay Adric's tunic, a garment of coarse, undyed wool the color of a winter sheep's fleece. It was less a piece of clothing and more a shield, thick, heavy, and pungent with the smells of wood smoke, sweat, and damp lanolin. An entire society of stitches held it together, a history of rips and repairs mapped across its surface. Her needle, a polished piece of bone, moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, pulling a thick, hand-spun thread through a new tear at the elbow. The thread itself was a testament to a year's labor. It began in the spring, with the shearing of their few sheep, a chaotic business of wrestling the greasy, struggling animals. It continued through the summer, when Ilara would sit outside the hut, a drop spindle hanging from her fingers, transforming the washed and carded wool into endless lengths of yarn. Her fingers were the engine of their survival, spinning the raw material of warmth from the chaos of the flock. Now, in the deep winter, that thread was more precious than silver. Each length she used to mend a tear was a piece of the future, spent to survive the present. The wool was not soft. It was a scratchy, irritating presence against the skin, a constant, low-grade discomfort that was as much a part of winter as the darkness. The children often scratched at their necks, their skin red and raw, but they did not truly complain. They had been born into a world where comfort was a myth. Warmth was the only truth that mattered, and the wool, for all its coarseness, was what trapped the precious heat of their bodies, creating a small, personal pocket of life against the killing cold. Their clothes were an architecture of layers. Closest to the skin was a thin linen shift, a relic of the summer, now gray and worn. Over that came the wool. For Adric and Finn, it was a tunic and rough trousers tied at the ankle with leather thongs to keep out drafts. For Ilara and Agnes, it was a long woolen kirtle. When they ventured outside for the brief necessary trips to the privy or the woodpile, they would add a heady cloak with a deep hood, another layer of defense. These garments were never truly dry. The smoky air of the hut kept them from freezing, but a deep, perpetual dampness clung to the fibers, a constant reminder of the world's hostility. While Ilara fortified their personal armor, Adric and Finn attended to the huts. Their work was messier, a form of primitive, desperate engineering. The wattle and daub walls of the longhouse were a marvel of peasant ingenuity, but they were in a constant state of decay. The freezing and thawing of the damp clay caused it to shrink and crack, opening up 100 tiny fronts for the wind to launch its assault. "Here, Finn," Adric grunted, his finger pointing to a hairline fracture near the floor. "I can feel its breath." The boy pressed his own small hand to the spot and nodded, his face serious. He could feel it too, a faint but steady trickle of icy air, a leak in their fortress. The repair required their standard ammunition, a thick, glutinous paste they mixed in a wooden bucket. The ingredients were simple and foul. They took a measure of the heavy clay soil from a pit dug in the floor, mixed it with a handful of chopped straw for binding, and then added the final crucial element, a scoop of fresh, wet dung from Bess the cow. The dung was a miracle ingredient. It was sticky, pliable,
and when it dried it became almost as hard as stone. It was also, of course, free and plentiful. Finn, his face wrinkled against the smell, would knead the mixture with his bare hands, the cold, wet paste clinging to his skin, stealing the warmth from his fingers until they were numb and clumsy. Adric would take a handful of the finished daub and press it firmly into the crack, working it deep into the fissure with his calloused thumb. The process was repeated a dozen times a day. They moved along the walls like tireless sentries, their eyes and hands searching for the slightest breach. They packed the mixture around the ill-fitting wooden shutter and jammed handfuls of loose straw into the larger gaps around the doorframe. Every plugged hole was a small, crucial victory, a moment's reprieve in a war that would last for months. As the last of the day's weak light failed, their focus shifted to the final line of defense, the bed. It was not a place of rest, but a tool of survival, a communal bastion designed for one purpose, to concentrate and preserve the heat of their four bodies through the night. Ilara would first fluff the deep straw of the mattress, creating air pockets that would serve as insulation against the cold seeping up from the packed earth floor. The rustling sound was loud in the quiet hut, a dry, whispering promise of warmth. Over this went a single, worn linen shift, and on top their collection of blankets. There were only two, one of heavy felted wool and another made of pieced-together rabbit skins, the fur worn thin in patches. These were not laid down neatly. They were arranged to create a sealed pocket with edges to be tucked in around their bodies. They undressed only their outer layers, keeping their woolen tunics on for sleeping. They climbed in according to their established geography of cold. Agnes in the protected center, Finn beside her, Ilara next, and finally Adric on the cold, exposed edge against the outer wall. They would pull the blankets up to their chins and then systematically tuck the edges under their bodies, creating a seal. They lay close, a human knot, their shoulders and hips pressed together. In the first few minutes, the bed was cold, the straw still holding the chill of the room. But slowly, miraculously, the combined heat of their four small furnaces began to work. The trapped air in the straw and the world warmed, creating a microclimate, a fragile bubble of life against the killing cold. Adric lay on his back, listening. The wind had picked up again, its moan rising to a shriek. He could hear it testing the fresh patch of daub near the door, a faint whistling sound. He felt a draft on his cheek and instinctively hunched his shoulder, closing the gap. He could feel the warmth of Ilara beside him, could hear the soft, even breathing of his children. They were safe, for now. Their defenses, the scratchy wool on their backs, the foul-smelling dung in their walls, the deep, rustling straw beneath them, were holding. It was a victory measured not in comfort or in peace, but in the simple, brutal fact of another night survived.
The sun died at 4 in the afternoon. It did not set in a blaze of glory, but was simply snuffed out, a weak candle flame extinguished by the immense, smothering darkness of the winter sky. Inside the longhouse, the world shrank to the small, flickering circle of firelight. The day's meager work was done. The tasteless pottage had been eaten, the wooden bowls scraped clean. Outside, the wind had begun its nightly sermon, a low, sorrowful howl that spoke of empty landscapes and endless night. Before the family lay a chasm of time, a great black ocean of hours that had to be crossed before the sun would grant them its brief, grudging return. To sit in silence was to invite madness, to let the mind dwell on the thinness of the walls, the dwindling pile of wood, and the gnawing ache in the belly. And so they fought back with the only weapon they had, the human voice. "Tell us a story, Father," Finn said, his small face, already smudged with soot,
turned expectantly towards Edric. This was the nightly ritual, a tradition as old and necessary as banking the fire. They would weave a tapestry of words to hang against the oppressive emptiness of the night. Edric cleared his throat, the sound a low rumble in the quiet hut. He stared into the flames for a long moment, gathering the threads of a tale. "Tonight," he began, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of an oft-told story, "is a tale of Reynard the Fox, on a night so cold that the moon itself cracked in the sky." He told the familiar story of the cunning fox outwitting a proud and foolish wolf, his words painting pictures in the smoky air. The children listened, rapt. Agnes giggled when the wolf's tail was frozen solid in the ice of the pond, and Finn's eyes gleamed with admiration at the fox's cleverness. For a few precious minutes, the longhouse was not a prison of cold and hunger, but a stage. The dancing shadows cast by the fire on the wattle walls became the characters, their forms twisting and elongating with Edric's words. It was a simple magic, a fragile shield against the vast, listening dark. When the tale of the fox was done, a quiet settled again, heavier this time. The brief warmth of the story had faded, making the cold seem more intense. It was Ilara's turn. Her stories were of a different sort. They were not of clever animals, but of suffering saints and a wrathful, watchful God. In the land of Ur there lived a good man named Job. He had many sheep and fine sons, and he thanked God for his bounty every day. She told the story of Job's trials, of the blights and the boils, of the loss of his wealth and his children. It was a harsh, unforgiving tale, but it was not meant to entertain. It was a lesson. It was a mirror held up to their own lives. Her voice did not waver as she spoke of Job's suffering, for it was a language her family understood intimately. The story was a reminder that their own hardship was part of a divine, unknowable plan. It gave their suffering a shape, a purpose, however cruel. To endure was not just a matter of survival, but an act of faith. But as the night wore on and the wind's howl grew more insistent, the stories turned darker still. The saints and clever foxes retreated, and older, more sinister things stirred in the shadows. These were Edric's other tales, the ones he told when the fire burned low, and the moon, the pale, skeletal hunger moon, climbed its frozen arch in the sky. These were the ghost stories. "The wind has a hunter's voice tonight," Edric murmured, poking the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the smoke. "It reminds me of the tale of Black John, the charcoal burner who froze to death in the woods on a night just like this." The children huddled closer. Even Finn, who tried to be brave like his father, drew his knees up to his chest. "They say," Edric continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "that his hunger was so great in his final hours that it could not die with his body. On the coldest nights, when the moon is thin and bright, his ghost still walks the forest path. He is not a fearsome spirit, not with chains or a ghastly moan. He is silent. He just appears. A tall, thin man, his face black with soot, his eyes hollow with a hunger that can never be filled. They say if he looks upon your larder, your grain will spoil, and your salted meat will turn to dust before the winter is out." A log in the fire cracked with a loud pop, and both children jumped. Agnes buried her face in Ilara's side. "Is it true, Papa?" Finn asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It is a story, boy," Edric said, but his eyes flickered for a half-second towards the corner where their own grain sack sagged. In the oppressive dark of winter, the line between a story and a warning was almost invisible. The ghost of Black John was not just a phantom, he was the personification of their deepest fear. He was the specter of starvation, given a name and a face. The wind shrieked, a sudden violent gust that rattled the wooden shutter over the window opening. The sound was like a human scream. "What was that?" Finn breathed, his eyes wide. "Only the wind," Ilara said, her arm a tight, protective band around her children, but her voice lacked conviction. The outside world was no longer merely empty, it was populated. The stories had given it life. The moan of the wind was no longer just the movement of air, it was the cry of a lost soul. A branch scraping against the roof was not just a branch, it was the skeletal finger of Black John, testing their defenses. The oppressive darkness was a living entity, its belly filled with the ghosts they had just summoned. These were the Hunger Moon's ghosts. They were born of the long nights, of empty stomachs, and of a deep, ancestral fear of the dark. They were the shadows of real-world anxieties given supernatural form. There was the tale of the will-o'-the-wisp, the ghostly light that led desperate, hungry travelers off the path and into the frozen marsh. A story that kept the children from ever wandering from the village in the twilight hours. There was the pixie, who soured the cow's milk if not left a small offering, a superstition that ensured not a single drop of precious milk was ever wasted. Edric fell silent, the last of his grim tales told. The only sound was the fire's crackle and the wind's endless, lonely song. He looked at the faces of his family illuminated in the dying orange light. Their eyes were wide, their expressions a mixture of fear and fascination. He had filled the black hours with his words, but in doing so, he had also sharpened the teeth of the night. He banked the fire, the ritualistic covering of the embers, a final solemn act. As the family moved to the straw bed, they moved with a new caution, their eyes darting towards the dark corners of the hut. As they lay huddled together, the stories lingered in the cold air. The wind was no longer just wind. The darkness was no longer just empty. It was alive, and it was hungry. And as Ilara lay listening to the slow, steady breathing of her children, she felt the cold, ghostly hand of a fear more real than any tale, the quiet, creeping dread that their own larder might not last until the sun returned for good.
The winter had ceased to be a season. It had become the world. For weeks, the sun was a rumor, a weak stain in a perpetually gray sky. The family's life had contracted into a tight, miserable knot of existence. The smoky confines of the longhouse, the bitter, wind-whipped path to the privy, and the grim, dwindling monument of the woodpile. Adric had watched this pile shrink with the same anxiety a man watches a leak in a boat. Once a reassuring bulwark against the cold, it was now a pathetic mound of snow-dusted logs, a stark and brutal calendar marking their remaining days. The crisis began not with a bang, but with a change in the wind's voice. For 2 days it had been a steady, mournful moan from the north. But on the third morning it shifted, coming from the northeast, off the great frozen sea. It brought with it a new sound, a high, sharp, whistling shriek that spoke of a deeper, more vicious cold, and it brought snow. It did not begin as a gentle flurry. The sky, a uniform sheet of iron gray, seemed to rupture, and the snow descended in a solid, blinding white curtain. It was a dry, granular snow that the wind immediately weaponized, blasting it against the hut with the force of a sandstorm.
Within an hour, the world outside their door was gone. The path, the neighboring huts, the stark black skeletons of the trees, all of it had been erased, swallowed by a roaring, featureless vortex of white. They were no longer on an island in the forest. They were adrift in a formless, hostile sea. Adric stood by the door, his hand pressed against the wood, feeling the relentless, percussive impacts of the wind-driven snow. "God have mercy," he murmured, his breath a cloud in the frigid air of the hut. "This is not a storm. This is a siege." Ilara was at the woodpile, the indoor one against the wall. Her movements were slow, her face grim. She was not gathering fuel, she was taking a census of the dead. She counted the remaining logs, her lips moving silently. She finished, her shoulders slumping with a weight that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. She looked at Adric, her eyes dark with a fear she no longer tried to hide. 4 logs, Adric, and a handful of kindling. The words fell into the smoky air with the finality of a judge's sentence. 4 logs. It was a pittance. With the fire kept to a bare smolder, it was perhaps enough to last them through the night and into the next day. If the blizzard continued beyond that, the heart of their world would stop beating. The cold inside the hut seemed to sense its advantage. It grew bolder, more aggressive. It was no longer a thing that lurked at the edges by the walls and the door. It now crept across the floor, a tangible presence that stole the warmth from their feet and settled like a shroud around their shoulders. The simmering pottage on the fire was not bubbling, but steaming weakly, its contents barely lukewarm. Agnes, who was huddled closest to the hearth, was shivering, her small body trembling in intermittent, violent spasms. The fire itself seemed to be shrinking, cowering. The last log Adric had placed upon it was burning with a sullen, reluctant flame that gave off more smoke than heat. It was a green log, one he hoped to save for another month. Now there was no choice. As the weak daylight failed completely, and the blizzard shrieked its unending song of fury, the family sat in a tight, miserable circle. The time for stories was over. The ghosts of the night were no match for the real, tangible monster trying to claw its way through their walls. They stared at the fire, watching their lifeblood burn away. "I could go to the woods," Adric said, his voice a low rasp. The words were spoken not with hope, but with the grim resolve of a man listing his own impossibilities. "No," Ilara's reply was sharp, fierce. "You would not get 10 paces from the door. The world is white. There is no path. You would be a frozen stone before you found a single branch." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "Do not leave us." He knew she was right. To step outside now was to commit suicide. He let the thought die. His gaze swept over their small, cramped world, searching for another option, another sacrifice the god of winter might accept. His eyes fell on the 3-legged stool he was sitting on. It was made of solid oak, darkened with age and smoke. His father had made it, carving it from a fallen branch of the great oak that stood on the edge of the village. Adric had sat on it as a boy, listening to his own father's stories. Its seat was worn smooth, shaped by the bodies of 2 generations. It was a piece of his history, a tangible link to a man long dead. It was also, he noted with a cold, brutal practicality, made of dry, seasoned wood. It would burn hot. He looked away, his stomach clenching. He then saw the large chest that sat against the far wall. It held Ilara's dowry, a set of linen she had woven herself, a small silver brooch from her mother, and the baptismal garns of their children. It was old, sturdy pine. It would burn for hours. To burn it would be to burn their memories, to feed the fire with the very fabric of their past. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the storm's rage and the chattering of Agnes's teeth. The final option remained, the one they had not yet dared to speak out loud. They could let the embers die. They could huddle together in the straw bed, pulling Bess the cow as close to the partition as possible. They could pile every blanket, every animal hide, every scrap of cloth they owned on top of themselves and create a human den. They would become animals, relying on nothing but their own shared body heat and the desperate flickering flame of their own lives. It was a terrifying gamble. If one of them sickened, the fever could spread through their nest like a fire. If the blizzard lasted for days, the cold would eventually win, leaching their warmth until their hearts, one by one, slowed and stopped. It was a slow, passive surrender. The time crawled by. Adric placed another log on the fire, his movements as solemn as a priest placing a sacrament on the altar. 3 remained. The family watched it catch, watched the precious flames lick at the wood, devouring their future. Elara finally broke the silence. "The stool," she whispered, her voice cracking. She would not look at it, her eyes fixed on the fire. The stool first. It was a concession of unimaginable grief, a sacrifice of a piece of their souls to keep their bodies alive. Adric did not reply. He simply stood and lifted the stool. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with years of memory. He ran his hand over the smooth, worn seat. He could almost feel the warmth of his father's body, could almost hear his voice in the howling wind. He carried it to the center of the room and picked up his small hand axe. He looked at his family. Thin was watching him, his eyes wide with a confused horror. Agnes was crying softly, not understanding the choice, but feeling the profound sorrow that filled the room. Elara had her face buried in her hands. He placed a stool on the packed earth floor. He raised the axe, the firelight glinting on its worn iron head. For a moment he hesitated, his arm trembling with the effort. He was not just a peasant trying to survive. He was a son, a keeper of memory. To bring the axe down was to sever that link, to admit that they were truly and utterly defeated, with nothing left to burn but their own history. The shriek of the blizzard outside seemed to mock his choice, a sound of triumph from an enemy that could not be fought, only fed.
The axe lay on the packed earth floor beside the splintered legs of the stool. Edric had not been able to bring himself to burn it. Not yet. He had broken it apart, the sharp crack of the old oak, a sound of desecration in the shrieking silence of the blizzard. But as he'd raised the first piece to feed the dying embers, a profound, stubborn stillness had settled in his heart. It was a refusal. He could not burn his father's memory, not while his own family still drew breath. And so they had chosen the other path, a slow surrender to the cold. The last ember had died just after midnight. The darkness that followed was absolute, a physical weight that pressed in from all sides. They had abandoned the hut to the frost and retreated into their final fortress, the straw bed. Huddled together in a single, shivering knot, wrapped in every scrap of wool and hide they owned, they had become a small, hibernating animal, praying that their collective warmth would be enough. The dawn, when it came, did not bring light, only a lesser shade of gray seeping through the cracks. The world outside was utterly silent. The blizzard had screamed itself hoarse and died, but its legacy was a cold so deep and profound it felt like the very bones of the earth had frozen. Inside the hut, the air was a visible fog, a thick layer of frost, delicate and cruel as spun glass, coated the inside of the walls.
Edric's beard was stiff with frozen breath. He could feel the life of his family in the faint tremors that ran through the huddle, the shallow, painful breaths they took. They were alive, but only just. Then came the sound, a heavy, muffled thump against the door. It was not the wind. It was a sound of purpose. Edric's heart, a sluggish, half-frozen thing, gave a painful lurch. He tried to move, but his limbs were stiff, his muscles seized by the cold. He disentangled himself from his family, the movement sending waves of icy air into their nest. Ilara moaned softly, pulling the children closer. He crawled to the door. It was blocked. A great heavy weight pressed against it from the outside. "Hello?" he croaked, his voice a dry, unused rasp. "Edric, are you in there? Is your family well?" The voice was deep, familiar, muffled by the wall of snow. It was Oswin, his neighbor, from the hut nearest the woods. "Aye, we are here," Edric shouted, a surge of adrenaline cutting through the cold's paralysis. He pushed against the heavy oak door with his shoulder. It didn't budge. He pushed again, his feet slipping on the frosted floor, a desperate animal grunt tearing from his throat. From outside, he heard the scrape of wood against snow, then another great thump as Oswin threw his own weight against the drift. The door groaned and moved an inch, then another. A sliver of blinding white light cut into the gloom. Edric eyed his eye to the crack. The world was gone, replaced by a wall of snow, but it was a wall that was being dismantled. He could see the blade of a crude wooden shovel digging, carving a passage to their door. 10 minutes later, the door was forced open wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Oswin stood there, a giant in a world of white. His beard was a solid cake of ice, his face raw and red from the wind, but his eyes were clear and full of a grim, shared purpose. Behind him, the village was a landscape transformed, a lumpy white desert under a bruised sky. But it was not a dead landscape. Figures moved through it, small, dark, and determined, their breath pluming as they worked, digging, clearing, reconnecting the severed arteries of their community. The Reeves buyer collapsed, took his best sow with it, broke her leg. He's slaughtering her now. There will be meat for all. The words were so momentous, so full of unbelievable promise that he could not at first comprehend them. Meat. The word itself was a taste, a memory of warmth and fat and strength. Is anyone lost?" Edric managed to ask. "Old Geetha's roof is down on one side, but she is safe. Her son is with her. We are digging her out now. The rest of us are accounted for." His gaze fell on the broken stool on the floor, then to the dead ashen fire pit. He saw the frost on the walls. He did not need to ask how close they had come. His expression softened with a shared understanding of the terror of a dying fire. "Get your shovel, man. The path to the well must be cleared before nightfall." It was not a request. It was a summons. It was the call of the chain. Edric felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with fire. It was the warmth of belonging, of being a link in something stronger than himself. He nodded, grabbed his own worn shovel, and followed Oswin out into the blinding, silent world. The work was a brutal, communal ballet. The men of the village, a small, ragged army of a dozen souls, moved with a practiced rhythm, their movements economical and free of wasted energy. They did not speak much, saving their breath. The only sounds were the scrape and crunch of their shovels and the grunts of exertion. They worked as one, clearing a central path that connected every hut, then branching off to the well, the livestock pens, the Reeves Hall. Finn, seeing his father at work, pulled on his cloak and joined him, using a flat piece of wood to clear the smaller drifts. He was learning the most important lesson of his life. A man's strength was not his own. It belonged to the village. A family could not survive a winter like this alone. A village, if every link held, just might. By noonday, a network of narrow, sunken paths had been carved through the snow, and the village was once again a single, connected entity. A great bonfire was lit in the center, fed by the splintered timbers of the Reeves' collapsed byre. It was a fire of shared loss and shared survival. Later, a boy came to their door, his hands red with cold, carrying a piece of wood on which lay a parcel wrapped in a damp cloth. It was their share. Elora took it with a reverence she usually reserved for the host at Mass. She unwrapped it on the table. Inside lay a slab of pork, glistening and red, and a long, glorious strip of pure white fat. There was a coil of intestines for sausage, and a piece of the liver, dark and rich. It was more meat than they had seen in 3 months. She looked up at Edric, and for the first time since the cold had set in, she saw tears welling in her eyes. But these were not tears of fear or sorrow. They were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude. This was not charity. This was the law of the village chain. The Reeve had lost a prize animal, but his loss, when shared, became the salvation of all. That night, the longhouse was transformed. The fire, fed by a log given to them by Oswin from his own less dwindled pile, roared with a defiant heat. For the first time in months, the room was filled not with the thin, smoky scent of smoldering embers, but with the rich, mouth-watering aroma of roasting pork fat. The sound of the fat sizzling and spitting as it dripped into the flames was the most beautiful music Elora had ever heard. They ate like wolves, tearing at the hot, succulent meat with their fingers, the grease running down their chins. The taste was an explosion of life, a memory of summer sun and autumn acorns, a powerful antidote to the monotonic, tasteless fare of winter. It was more than food. It was a sacrament, a communion that bound them not just to each other, but to the entire village. After the meal, Edric sat by the fire, its heat soaking deep into his bones. He looked at the splintered legs of his father's stool, still lying where he had left them. He had been ready to burn his past to survive the present. But the chain had held. The village had saved him. He knew that tomorrow he would mend the stool, its scars a reminder of how close they had come. And he knew that the next time the storm came, the next time a neighbor's roof collapsed or their larder ran empty, he would be the first one out the door, shovel in hand, ready to strengthen his own link in the fragile, essential chain that kept their small, flickering world alive.
The feast of the Reeves' slaughtered pig was a brief, glorious defiance of winter. For 2 days, the longhouse was filled with the rich, unctuous smell of roasting fat and the rare, miraculous feeling of full bellies. The children's cheeks gained a touch of color, and Edric's mood, usually as grim and gray as the winter sky, had lightened. They had faced the blizzard's siege and broken it with the strength of their village chain. They had won. But winter had more than one weapon. Its most patient and insidious general was not the wind or the snow, but the silent thief that traveled on the cold, thin air and crept into the warm, unsuspecting blood. The attack began without a sound. It was in the way little Agnes, usually a bright, chattering spark by the fire, became quiet and still. She pushed away her morning bread, even the piece Ilara had garnished with a precious sliver of pork fat. She did not want to play with the smooth gray stones that were her only toys. She simply curled up in the straw bed, her small face turned to the wall, a single woolen blanket pulled up to her chin.
"She is tired," Edric said, his voice laced with a hope he did not feel. "The cold has wearied her." Ilara did not answer. She went to her daughter's side and laid the back of her hand against Agnes's forehead. The touch was an answer more damning than any words. The child's skin was dry and burned with a fierce, unnatural heat. Ilara's heart, which had just begun to unclench from the terror of the storm, seized into a cold, hard knot. The wind could be barred, the snow could be shoveled, but this enemy was already inside their fortress. This was the fever, the ancient, nameless ague that came with the damp and the cold. It was the silent thief that had stolen 2 of her own siblings in her childhood, a creature that needed no door to enter and could not be fought with an axe. A new kind of war council was convened in the smoky gloom. Edric, the man of action, was now rendered helpless. His strength, his knowledge of the land and the seasons, was useless against this foe. He paced the length of the hut like a caged animal, his heavy footsteps a rhythm of impotent anxiety. He could build a wall and mend a roof, but he could not mend his own child. Ilara became the commander. Her movements were now sharp with a grim, focused purpose. Her knowledge, passed down from her mother and her mother before her, was their only weapon. This was not the lore of the priests, with their Latin prayers and promises of an afterlife. This was the older, earthier magic of root and leaf, of bark and berry, the whispered wisdom of women who had fought this same battle in this same hut for generations. Her first act was to clear a space around the fire. She made a pallet for Agnes, closer to the hearth for its warmth, but not so close to inflame her fever. She went to the small, intricately carved wooden box that sat on a high shelf, away from the damp of the floor. This was her apothecary. She opened it with a reverence usually reserved for a holy relic. Inside, the air was filled with the dry, fragrant ghosts of summer, the sharp, clean scent of yarrow, the faint, sweet perfume of elderflowers, the bitter, earthy smell of willow bark. Each herb had been gathered at its proper time, under the correct moon, and dried with painstaking care in the rafters. They were a pathetic arsenal against the great consuming power of a fever, but they were all she had. Her hands moved with the certainty of ritual. She selected a handful of feathery yarrow leaves and a pinch of elderflower, crushing them in a small stone mortar. This she steeped in a cup of hot water, creating a pale, fragrant tea. "Drink, little bird," she murmured, lifting Agnes's head. The child was listless, her eyes glazed with fever. She whimpered as the hot liquid touched her lips, but Ilara was firm, tipping the cup until a few swallows went down. The yarrow, she prayed, would make her sweat, would force the fire in her blood to break through the skin. The day crawled by. Agnes's fever did not break, it climbed. Her breathing grew shallow and quick, punctuated by a dry, hacking cough that seemed to tear at her small frame. Edric stopped his pacing. He sat on the floor by the pallet, his great, calloused hand resting on his daughter's back, as if he could lend his own brute strength to her struggling lungs. As twilight fell, Ilara prepared her second weapon. She took one of the precious onions from the rafter and chopped it fine, mixing it with hot animal fat to create a pungent, greasy poultice. She spread the warm, foul-smelling mixture on a piece of clean linen and laid it on Agnes's chest. The sharp, eye-watering scent filled the longhouse, a desperate, medicinal smell that overpowered even the smoke and the beasts. It was meant to draw out the sickness, a physical assault on the invisible thief in her lungs. Night came. The wind rose again, a mournful counterpoint to the child's ragged breathing. There were no stories told this night. There was only the sound of the fire and the wind, and the rasp of Agnes's fight for every breath. She had grown delirious. She muttered fragments of words, her small hands plucking at the blankets. She spoke of a white wolf with cold blue eyes, a vision born of the fever's fire and her father's winter tales. Edric, watching her, felt a cold despair unlike any he had ever known. He could face a real wolf with his axe and his courage, but how did a man fight a wolf made of smoke and fever? How did he protect his child from a monster that was already inside her? He felt his faith, a simple, unquestioning thing, begin to fray. He had given his tithe to the priest, had attended Mass, had said his prayers, but God felt very far away from this hut, and the devil felt very, very close. Ilara did not stop working. She brewed another tea, this one from the bitter shreds of willow bark, to soothe the pain. She bathed Agnes's burning forehead with cloths dipped in snow-melted water, a delicate balance, trying to cool the fire without inviting a deeper chill. Her face was a mask of concentration, but her heart was a cold, silent scream. She saw the ghosts of the village's lost children in the flickering firelight, their small, pale faces a chorus of warning. She remembered young Will, the blacksmith's son, taken by this same thief last winter. She remembered the terrible, final stillness of his body. The crisis came in the hour before dawn, the same hour that had almost claimed them in the blizzard. Agnes's breathing became a faint, terrifying flutter. A bluish tinge appeared around her lips. Her body, which had been thrashing, went limp and still. Edric let out a sound, a raw, strangled sob. "She is gone!" "No, not yet." Ilara's voice was a blade of sound in the dark. She grabbed the child, pulling her into a sitting position, her hand thumping firmly on her small back. "Breathe, Agnes, breathe!" she commanded, not to the child, but to the life within her, to the stubborn, flickering spark. She pressed her own mouth to her daughter's lungs, forcing her own warm, desperate breath into her. For a long, terrible moment, there was nothing. The hut was silent, save for the fire and the wind. Then a shudder ran through Agnes's small body. She took a single, deep, ragged, rattling breath. It was a terrible sound, the sound of a drowning person breaking the surface. It was followed by another, and then a harsh fit of coughing. And then, as if a dam had broken, a great wave of sweat erupted across the child's skin. Her hair was instantly soaked, her small tunic dark with it. The fever had broken. The fire in her blood, finally defeated by the yarrow and her own small stubborn heart, was quenching itself in a flood. They lay her back down. Her breathing was still weak, but it was deep and even. The bluish tinge had faded from her lips. She was slick with sweat and smelled of onions and sickness, but she was alive. Edric buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulder shaking with silent, racking sobs of relief. Ilara simply sat, her body numb with exhaustion, her gaze fixed on her daughter's sleeping face. She had won for today. The silent thief had been driven back, but she knew it was still out there, lurking in the cold, waiting. They had survived the wind, the snow, the hunger, and now the fever. But each victory was a temporary reprieve in a war that was never truly over, a war that underscored the terrible, beautiful fragility of the small, warm lives huddled together in the heart of the longhouse.
This was the night the world died. It was not a violent death, not a screaming end, but a quiet, final exhalation. The blizzard's rage had been a mercy compared to this. Now there was only a silence so profound and absolute that it felt like the very air had frozen solid, a great, clear crystal encasing the earth. The moon was a sliver of bleached bone in a sky of polished jet, its light offering no warmth, only a cold, spectral illumination that made the snow-draped landscape look like a field of sleeping ghosts. This was midwinter, the longest, darkest, and coldest night of the year. Inside the longhouse, the family had retreated to the last square foot of defensible territory.
The fire, the great roaring heart of their existence, was dying. It was no longer a creature of flame and heat, but a small, pathetic patient in its final throes. A handful of embers pulsed with a weak, intermittent ruby light at the bottom of the ash pit. On top of them lay the last of their fuel. Not a log, not even a branch, but a splintered piece of oak, its surface worn smooth by the hands of a dead man. It was the last leg of Edric's father's stool. They had burned the rest of it in the preceding hours, each piece a sacrament and a sacrilege. The wood, old and perfectly seasoned, had burned hot and bright, a brief, glorious defiance that felt like burning their own history to stay warm. Now only this last piece remained. It smoldered with a stubborn reluctance, giving off a thin, almost invisible trickle of smoke. Its faint warmth did not reach the straw bed. It was a symbolic fire, a final guttering candle against an infinite dark. The family was a single breathing entity, a mound of wool and fear in the straw. They had not spoken for hours. Words were an energy they could not afford to waste. Alara lay with her back to the room, her body curled around Agnes. The child, though weak, was blessedly asleep, her small, even breaths a fragile rhythm against her mother's chest. Alara focused on the small patch of warmth where their bodies met, a tiny, precious island of life. She made it her entire world, the anchor for her mind against the terrifying sea of cold. Edric sat on the edge of the nest, his watch a grim, motionless vigil. His heavy cloak was pulled tight, but it felt as thin as linen against the crushing cold. He watched the last piece of the stool slowly turn to black charcoal. When its faint glow was finally extinguished, the true siege would begin. He felt the cold not as an absence of heat, but as a presence. It was a silent predator that had already consumed the world outside and was now inside the hut with them, patiently waiting for their own small internal fires to go out. His gaze moved from the dying embers to the huddle of his family. In the profound, featureless dark, he could barely make out their forms. For a terrifying moment, his tired, frightened mind played a trick on him. He was suddenly convinced that he was the only one left awake, that the stillness from the bed was not the stillness of sleep, but of death. He imagined their bodies already stiffening, their lungs filled with frozen air. The despair was a physical blow, a great cold hand squeezing his heart, urging him to simply lie down, to close his eyes, to let the silence take him too. He fought it. He focused on a sound, the only sound in the dead world, the faint, wet rasp of Bess the cow's breathing from behind the partition. The sound was a lifeline. It was real. It was life. He clung to it, a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. The final ember on the splintered oak winked out. The darkness was now complete. The faint glow was gone, and with it the last illusion of defense. The cold, no longer held at bay by even a symbolic warmth, advanced. It seeped up from the packed earth floor, radiated from the frost-coated walls, and descended from the smoke hole in the roof. He could feel it probing, seeking the life in him, in his wife, in his children. He slid into the nest, his body a block of ice. He pressed himself against Alara's back, adding his failing warmth to their collective store. He pulled the heavy rabbit skin cover over his head, entombing them. The air inside their small cocoon was thick and stale, but it was degrees warmer than the room. They lay like that for an eternity, a small, warm-blooded island in a world that had returned to the age of ice. Edric did not sleep. He listened to the 4 sets of breathing, his own, Ilara's, Finn's, Agnes's, and the 5th, the slow, deep rhythm of the beast behind the wall. It was the only prayer he had left. The dawn did not break, it seeped. a slow, reluctant leakage of gray, lifeless light that did nothing to warm the world, only to reveal the full extent of its desolation. The inside of the hut was a crystalline cave. Every surface, the walls, the rafters, the sleeping forms on the bed, was coated in a thick, feathery layer of white frost. The water in the bucket by the door was a solid block of ice. It was the unwaking dawn, a dawn without hope, a confirmation that the sun had lost its power forever. Edric felt the deepest despair of his life settle upon him. They had survived the night, but to what end? To slowly starve in a world that would never be warm again? The silence was absolute. The fire was dead. The wind was dead. The world was a tomb. And then he heard it. Plink. The sound was tiny, insignificant, yet in the cathedral of silence it was as loud as a hammer blow on an anvil. It was a clean, clear, metallic sound. He lay perfectly still, straining his ears, his entire being focused on that single, impossible noise. Had he imagined it? Was it a trick of a mind strained by cold and fear? Plink. There it was again. It was not inside the hut. It was outside. It was the sound of a single drop of water, having melted from the thatch of the eaves, falling onto the ice-sheathed stone step below. Plink. He slowly, stiffly extricated himself from the huddle. His every movement was an agony. He crawled to the door, his hands and knees protesting. He pressed his eye to a tiny crack in the wood. The world outside was still a portrait of white and gray, a study in death. But the sun, a pale, anemic disk, was clear of the horizon. Its light, though seemingly powerless, had struck a single, south-facing icicle hanging from the roof, and in a quiet, secret miracle had liberated a single drop of water. Plink. Elara was awake. He turned and saw her eyes open in the gloom. He did not have to speak. He could see in her gaze that she had heard it too. She understood its meaning. It was not spring. It was not even a thaw. The air was still lethally cold. The larder was still terrifyingly empty. The long, brutal winter of road still stretched for weeks, perhaps months before them. The single drop of water changed none of that. But it changed everything. It was a sign, a promise. It was proof that the sun, however weak, had not been defeated. It was a crack in winter's armor. It was the first note in a song of renewal that was still weeks away from being sung. Edric looked at his wife, at the frost on her hair that looked like a crown of silver, and a single hot tear escaped his eye. It traced a path down his cold, numb cheek and froze there, a tiny jewel of salt and hope. He had not wept during the blizzard, nor in the face of starvation, nor even when his daughter lay dying. He wept now for the sound of a single drop of water. The longest night was over. The siege had been broken, not by an army, but by a single insistent sunbeam. They had huddled in the dark, had burned their past and faced their own extinction, and they had endured. They had survived the unwaking dawn.